So today I'm going to show you how to use the new Polyglot for GenX UI. I'll start by giving you an overview of the structure of the task. So in this particular task, we have three kind of message groups. One here, and one here. So I'll be translating each of these messages for you today so you can get a feel for how to do it on your own. So I'm going to start by translating the first message here. Before you click in, this message kind of just might appear like any other polyglot task. But as soon as I click in, we see that something different happens. The template appears. So as you learned in the instructions, the template is kind of like a blueprint for a Google Assistant response that allows it to produce a whole bunch of different responses that can adapt to the context and the situation of the question being asked. But right here we see some of those example responses. These are the output examples. So they're the different ways the assistant can respond, but all of them are produced by this single template. So in the template we have this text. It's just normal text, and we call this the static text, black text with white background. This text is called static because it doesn't change across different output examples. So you can see here below, looking at the output examples, looks like it's the same across all. So basically, no matter what response the assistant gives from this template, it looks like is going to stay the same. And then we have the dynamic part of the template, which is represented by colored blocks that we call dynamic placeholders. This part changes according to the context of the question being asked, and we can see that below. The colored text, the dynamic text that corresponds to this dynamic placeholder, it changes example to example. We have looks like a bird, looks like a dog, looks like a computer, looks like an artichoke. It's changing across the different output examples, and that's why it's dynamic. So your job as a translator is to edit the template directly, translating the static text and editing the dynamic parts, the dynamic placeholders, until all output examples are translated correctly in Spanish, they sound grammatically correct, and they match the English meaning. So I'm going to get started and show you what that looks like. And a quick disclaimer before I begin is that I'm not fluent in Spanish. It's not my native language, so I'm probably going to mispronounce some words, and I apologize in advance. Okay, so I'm going to start my translation. Parece. And I can see as I translate, the output examples update according to what I've typed in for the static text. Okay, so I'm going to start by reading through the examples and seeing if everything looks good. And when I do this, you should first look at the English, looks like a bird, and then read the Spanish, parece ave, to make sure they match up. And right away with this first example, we see an issue because it just says looks like bird. It should say looks like a bird. We need an article. In the case of Spanish, we need un for ave. So if you're not that familiar with this tool, something you might think to do at first is just to add un to the static text, like so. And that makes most of the examples correct. Parece un ave, un perro, un ordenador. But as soon as I come to the last one, I see that it doesn't look right. And that's because artichoke in Spanish is feminine. So it needs a feminine article. It should say una instead of un. So what does this tell me? It tells me that un can't be a part of the static text because it can't be the same across all examples. We need it to change according to the gender of the noun we're talking about here. So it should be un for the first three and then una for the last one. So how do I do that? Well, one way to do this is just to click on the dynamic placeholder and edit this. When I click on the dynamic placeholder, I see the placeholder settings panel appears, and there's a bunch of different options I can choose from for how to edit this particular placeholder. So as I hover over these different options, I can see how each option will affect the output examples. And this will help me choose which one will make the sentence correct. Okay, so this first one here actually looks right. As we can see, it makes un become part of the dynamic text. So we see for the first three it says un, but for the last one, una, because alcachofa is feminine. That's exactly what we want. So now I can go ahead and delete the un from the static text, watch the examples update, and then read through them one more time to make sure everything looks correct. Looks like a bird, parece un ave. If it's correct, I can click this check mark. Looks like a dog, parece un perro. Looks correct. Looks like a computer, parece, okay, correct. Artichoke, una alcachofa. Perfect. So we've checked everything off. It's all correct. Once we do that, you can see that the whole template becomes marked off. And we're finished with this translation. Before I move on to the next message, however, I want to show you two more features. So first is drag and drop. You can use drag and drop to move the placeholders around in the sentence, like so. In the case that you need to change word order from English to Spanish. So that's a useful feature to keep in mind. The last thing I want to show you is the can't be translated button. So you should use this when you can't get all of the output examples to be translated correctly, no matter how you manipulate the template. So even though you translated static text, for each dynamic placeholder, you've looked through all the different options in the placeholder settings panel. Maybe you've tried adding some agreements using the insert placeholder button. Nothing seems to work. There's still maybe one or two examples that don't sound correct. In this case, you should just click the can't be translated button. You'll be prompted to provide an explanation. Please be very specific and clear in your explanation as to why you couldn't translate the template correctly. So for example, I couldn't get example B correct. The noun dog should have a masculine article. All placeholder options produced feminine articles. Something like that. And then you would just click submit. So that's how you mark something as can't be translated. Again, please only do this if you've looked through all the different placeholder settings options in this panel for each dynamic placeholder. As you can see, there are a lot of options, and one of them near the bottom might be the one that makes all the examples correct. So just make sure you try out everything before you use this feature. So how do you want to the next message? Walking directions 2. Okay. So for this one, we just start the exact same way. We start by translating the static text. Okay. And I watch the output examples update. And then again, I'm going to read through them and see if everything looks correct. Walking directions to ports. Okay, that looks correct. Okay, in this second example B, I already see an issue. It says AL, but it should say AL. As you know, when A and L are together, they shouldn't be separate. They should instead form the contraction AL. But this only needs to happen for certain examples, such as example 2, when L is present. In other cases, like the first example, A can be separate from the article. So, as you might guess, that means that we can't just put AL as part of the static text, because if we do, it makes, the second, it's not going to be correct for all examples. So how do we handle this? Again, we can try editing the dynamic placeholder and see if there's something that incorporates into the dynamic text. So I can click that again and just use my mouse to hover over the different options and see if something looks right, and I found it. This one introduces into the dynamic part, and we can see in example B, it changes to AL, just like we would like it to. Perfect. So then I can again remove from the static text so we don't have duplicate words. And read over everything to make sure it's correct. Walking directions to ports. Perfect. Al. Walking directions to ala. Perfect. Alos. Alas. Okay, so everything looks correct. And now I'm finished with this second example. Time to move on to the third one. So this last one is a bit trickier than the other ones we've seen because it has multiple dynamic placeholders, as you can see here. So I'm going to start still the same way I did before by translating the static text. We can watch the examples update. Then we can read through and see if everything's looking correct. Okay, right away we see the same issue that we saw in the previous example where al should be a contraction al in some cases, but it doesn't need to be a contraction in other cases, like here, Hollanda, Allah. So I think we can make the part of the dynamic text like we did before. So I can click the dynamic placeholder that corresponds to the word that I want to change, the phrase I want to change. I can find that other placeholder we found before. Allah. Okay, perfect. So this is what we want. As you can see, it makes al become a contraction here where we need it, but keep the article separate where we don't. Okay. So now that looks right. We can read through again and see if everything's correct. Al enter de Milan. Okay, correct. Second one. Okay, these are all looking correct. Oh, I need to delete the A from the static text. It's easy to miss little details like this, so just be very diligent as you're translating. Okay, there we go. So now it's actually correct. Al. There we go. So I'm just reading through very carefully. Beat. Allah. Okay. Okay. So this example actually doesn't look correct. And why is that? Well, that's because this word gano needs to be plural for this case. It should be ganaron because the word here is plural instead of singular. Plural words need plural verbs. That's the case for a couple other examples down here as well. We see a team here is plural, so it should say ganaron. So this means that the verb gano, it needs to change in some cases to be plural, but in other cases to be singular. As you might guess, that means it needs to be dynamic. But how do we change a standalone word like gano into a dynamic placeholder? I'll show you how to do that now. So you should just select the word in question that you want to change to become dynamic. What you can do is turn it into a dynamic placeholder. You do this by adding a new placeholder using placeholder menu. When we open this, we see a list of different options. These dynamic placeholders are specifically called agreements, and they're described in more detail in the instructions deck you received. For this one, I want the first option, concordancia verbal, because this is a verb, and I want to use the verb agreement. So I click on this, and once I do, I see a field appears with a bunch of different options I can choose from, or I can fill in. So what I want to do first is select the block that this verb should agree with. We have two options here. I'm going to choose this first one, as you can see here, because it's the subject of the sentence, and the verb should agree with the subject of the sentence in this case. So I click this, and then I can just fill in the singular and plural versions of the word. Here we go. And click save. Once I click save, the output example should update with my translations. And I'm going to read through everything again and make sure that it all looks correct. So we see that these all remained checked off because the output examples didn't change. It still says gano. We come down in here and we see get out on. Perfect. The plural word has a plural verb that agrees with it. Singular here, genau. And then these last two, which are plural, have plural verbs. So everything looks correct, and we have finished the translation. Thanks for watching, and now it's your turn to get it translating.